Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're looking at one of the absolute most fascinating underdog stories in the history of modern business and global public health. It's a story where chemistry, international law, and honestly, sheer public shame were weaponized to fundamentally change the world. We're going to explore the $1 a day revolution and how exactly one company used price not just as a financial metric, but as an undeniable moral weapon. Let's get into it. Okay, let's dive into this by anchoring ourselves in the staggering, literal, life-or-death math of the year 2000. Back then, the standard of care for HIV was a highly active antiretroviral cocktail. You might know it as HAART. In the US and Europe, this treatment was running between $10,000 and $15,000 per patient every single year. Now, contrast that with the grim reality in Africa at the time. You had 25 million people infected with the virus, but only about 2,000 people were actually receiving treatment. Total. It's just an incredibly devastating number. The disparity was so massive, so deeply structural, that Doctors Without Borders actually coined a specific term for it. They called it the HIV treatment apartheid. And honestly, it perfectly encapsulated the systemic inequality in global healthcare at the turn of the millennium. The harsh reality was this: if you lived in a wealthy nation, you had a fighting chance. If you didn't, you simply didn't get the medicine. Now, to really understand how things got to this point, we have to look fairly at the arguments being made by the massive pharmaceutical giants. Their stance? Well, they argued that these extremely high prices were absolutely necessary to fund vital research and development. They said patents had to be protected to incentivize future cures, right? And they added that underdeveloped regions in Africa simply didn't have the medical infrastructure to handle such complex, highly monitored drug regimens anyway. So what was the outcome of this stance? Everything they were saying was technically legally true, but on the ground, when you're looking at millions of dying people, it was widely viewed as entirely morally indefensible. Which brings us to a huge pivotal moment and our central underdog. Enter the man who would basically walk right into the middle of this massive crisis and promise to completely shatter the monopoly. His name is Yusuf Hamied. In September 2000, Hamied walked into a European Commission meeting on AIDS and made an announcement that literally sent shockwaves through the entire pharmaceutical industry. You see, Yusuf Hamied wasn't just some outsider throwing stones. He was a Cambridge-trained chemist and the chairman of Cipla, a major pharmaceutical company based in Mumbai, India. At that European Commission meeting, he stood up and boldly claimed that his company could supply that exact same standard three-drug HAART cocktail for a mere fraction of what the Western pharma companies were charging. And by February 2001, he actually made good on that promise. And the number he gave? It was shocking. Hamied offered the three-drug cocktail to Doctors Without Borders for just $350 for a full year of treatment. For African governments, he priced it at $600 a year. But that $350 figure, that was the magic number. Because when you break it down, that is less than $1 single a day. Hamied delivered a line to the press right around this time that has gone down in history. He said, "My company is not making a profit on this, but at least we're not making a killing either." Talk about a brilliant, pointed statement, right? Because of bold moves like this, Big Pharma labeled him a pirate. But you know what? Hamied didn't run from that title at all. He proudly wore it as a badge of honor. Now, what's really interesting about this is that pulling this off required way more than just deciding to slash a price tag. It was an absolute masterclass in leveraging three very specific mechanisms: chemistry, law, and supply. Without all three of these working perfectly in tandem, the $1 a day revolution would have been completely impossible. Let's start with the law. The absolute foundation of this entire strategy was a massive legal loophole known as the Indian Patent Act of 1970. This law was super unique because it recognized process patents, but it explicitly did not recognize product patents for pharmaceuticals. So what does that actually mean? It meant that while the major companies held global product patents on these specific drugs, it was completely legal in India for Cipla to reverse engineer the manufacturing process. Basically, as long as they figured out a different way to cook up the same molecule, they weren't breaking any Indian laws. Okay, then came the chemistry, and this is brilliant. Cipla didn't just copy the existing pills, they actually innovated. In 2001, they launched a product called Triomune. This was the world's very first fixed-dose combination pill for HIV. They essentially figured out how to cram 3 distinct antiretroviral drugs, Lamivudine, Stavudine, and Nevirapine, into one single pill that a patient only needed to take twice a day. And that chemistry is exactly why Triomune was such a total game changer. Remember Big Pharma's big argument that African villages lack the medical infrastructure for complex regimens? Well, Triomune solved that problem instantly. It replaced 3 separate pills that had super confusing different dosing schedules. It totally bypassed the need for refrigeration. It eliminated the need for complex continuous doctor supervision. It literally made remote village distribution possible for the first time. In fact, the World Health Organization later validated this completely, stating that a combination pill is vastly easier to distribute and just way more convenient for the users. Finally, we have the supply chain. You might be wondering, how on earth did the cost drop so radically? The secret sauce here is vertical integration. Think about it. If Cipla had to buy the active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs, from other suppliers, the cost still would have hovered around $12,000. But because Cipla made all those APIs entirely in-house, they completely controlled their own production pipeline. This supply chain genius is exactly what drove the cost all the way down to that miraculous $350 mark. But hey, this explainer isn't just about a medical breakthrough, it is about a truly fascinating, super aggressive business strategy. Make absolutely no mistake here, what Yusuf Hamied was doing wasn't just charity, not at all. This was a highly calculated campaign of market conquest. He knew for a fact he couldn't compete directly with Big Pharma in the US market. So instead, he created a parallel market where those giants simply could not win. Hamied essentially laid a brilliant trap, and he executed it in 3 specific steps. Step 1, use shame as a strategy. By offering the drug right at cost to Doctors Without Borders, literally every newspaper in the world suddenly started comparing a $12,000 price tag to a $350 price tag. Instantly, the pharmaceutical giants were painted as the villains of the story. Step 2, force institutional buyers to switch. And Step 3, destroy the traditional patent narrative entirely. Step 2 is where the market truly shifted under their feet. Hamied realized his true customers weren't actually the impoverished patients, who obviously had no money. His real customers were the massive institutions operating on limited donor funds. We're talking about groups like the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and the Clinton Foundation. He basically presented them with an unavoidable mathematical dilemma. With your limited budget, option A is to treat one single person with a patented drug. Option B is to treat 30 people with Cipla's drug. Because of fiduciary duty and, frankly, moral obligation, they were mathematically forced to buy from Cipla. Let's move along and see how this rapidly builds into a massive domino effect, leading right into Step 3, destroying the patent narrative. After his pledge in 2000, the WTO actually passed the Doha Declaration in 2001, officially ruling that public health overrides patents, which allowed for compulsory licensing. The dominoes fell so fast after that. By 2003, the Clinton Foundation brokered a massive deal to supply 66 developing countries. Soon after that, the U.S. government's massive AIDS relief plan, PEPFAR, started buying Cipla's drugs too. The sheer human impact of this strategy is just breathtaking. By the period of 2005 to 2007, Cipla had become the world's largest supplier of antiretroviral drugs by volume. The price, which Hamied had already shocked the world by setting at $1 a day, it eventually plummeted to just 20 cents a day. And the best part? More than 6 million people in the developing world, people who had absolute zero access to these medications just a few years prior, were finally receiving life-saving treatment. So the crucial point we really need to take away from all this is, what can we actually learn from it today? Whether you are studying business, public health, or you're just looking at how to disrupt an established industry, the core lesson from the $1 a day revolution is that price is positioning. Think about traditional business logic for a second. It dictates that cost plus margin equals price. That is exactly how the giants operated. But Hamied, he operated on an entirely different equation. For him, price equaled narrative plus distribution plus monopoly destruction. He realized that an ultra-low price makes it completely morally impossible for anyone to argue against you. It also makes your scale a permanent moat. Think about it. At just $350 a year, no competitor could financially justify building a brand new factory for the African market. Cipla effectively became the undisputed default option. So here are your major takeaways if you're ever looking to disrupt the giants in your industry. First, you have to identify your real customer. As we saw, it might actually be institutions buying for millions, not the end users themselves. Second, use rapid scale to prevent competitors from even entering the arena.
And third, and perhaps most importantly, Cipla proved once and for all that doing well by doing good is entirely possible. But, and this is a big but, only if your moral stance is structurally leveraged. You can't just have good intentions. Your good has to be backed up by hard chemistry, bulletproof IP law, and an ironclad supply chain.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. When you look at an entrenched, monopolized system, the path to true disruption rarely ever lies in making slight, incremental improvements. So, you have to ask yourself, if you are entering a market dominated by giants, are you just trying to be 10% cheaper, or are you trying to be 90% cheaper and absolutely morally undeniable? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.